You know this feeling. Something small happens, and somehow it follows you for the rest of the day. Maybe it was a comment, a tone, a look that didn't sit right. At first, you brush it off, but then it comes back. While you're driving, while you're working, while you're trying to focus on something that actually matters. And by the time night comes, you're still there, replaying it, rewriting what you should have said, imagining better responses, arguing with someone who isn't even in front of you anymore. They moved on. You didn't. And that's the part no one talks about. It's not the moment that drains you. It's the replay, the loop, the quiet mental movie that keeps running long after the scene is over. You tell yourself next time will be different. Next time you'll stay calm. Next time you won't let it get to you. But next time comes, and it's the same pattern. Different person, different situation, same reaction, same tension in your chest, same rush of emotion, same loss of control. And if you're honest, it's exhausting. Not because life is that hard, but because your mind never stops fighting it. Here's the truth most people never hear. You're not stuck because the world keeps provoking you. You're stuck because no one ever taught you what to do after the provocation happens. So you react, or you suppress. But either way, you carry it. And over time, that weight builds, quietly, until one day, you realize something uncomfortable. You're not living your life. You're reacting to it. But what if that entire pattern could break, not by controlling the world, but by finally learning how to control what happens inside you? Because once you see that clearly, everything starts to change. Here's where most people get it wrong. They think the problem is out there. The rude people, the pressure, the constant interruptions, the things that don't go their way. So they spend their lives trying to manage the outside, avoid certain people, control every situation, plan everything perfectly so nothing goes wrong. But no matter how much they try, something always slips through. Someone says the wrong thing. Something unexpected happens. Life refuses to follow the script. And just like that, they're pulled right back into the same reaction. Frustration, overthinking, emotional noise. Because the real problem was never the world. It was the lack of control over what happens inside you. No one teaches you this growing up. No one sits you down and explains that your thoughts will try to run your life, that your emotions will try to convince you they're facts, that your mind will replay, exaggerate, and distort reality if you let it. So, you grow up believing every reaction is justified. If you feel angry, there must be a reason. If you feel disrespected, it must be real. If something bothers you, it must matter. But that belief is exactly what keeps you trapped, because it means your internal state is constantly being decided by external events. Someone else's words control your mood. A random situation controls your focus. A single moment controls your entire day. That's not strength. That's dependence. The Stoics saw this clearly thousands of years ago. They understood that most people are not living freely. They are being pulled, pushed, and shaped by whatever happens around them, like leaves in the wind. And until you see this, you can't change it, because you'll keep trying to fix the outside while the real issue stays untouched. So the question isn't, how do you control the world? The question is much simpler and much harder. Can you stop the world from controlling you? Because that's where everything begins. Pillar 1, what you control vs. what controls you. Everything changes the moment you see this clearly. There are only two categories in your life: what you control and what you don't. That's it. But most people live as if there's a third category, things they should be able to control, other people's behavior, other people's opinions, outcomes, timing, respect, recognition. And this is where the frustration begins, because the mind keeps arguing with reality. They shouldn't have said that. This shouldn't be happening. This isn't fair. But reality doesn't negotiate. It just is, and every time you resist it, you create friction inside yourself. That tension you feel, that's not the event. That's your resistance to it. Epictetus said it simply, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it. Most people hear that and nod, but they don't actually apply it. Because applying it means something uncomfortable, letting go of control you never had. You don't control what people say. You don't control how they act. You don't control how you're perceived, but you do control your response, your focus, your behavior, your standards. And when you shift your attention fully into that space, something strange happens. The chaos starts to quiet down. Not because the world became easier, but because you stopped fighting the wrong battles. Think about how much energy you've wasted trying to control things outside you, replaying conversations, trying to change how someone sees you, worrying about outcomes that haven't even happened yet. All of that, gone, because it was never yours to carry. This is the first layer of real power, not dominance, not control over others, control over yourself. And once you build that, you stop being pulled in every direction. You become still. And in a world full of reactive people, that stillness makes you different. Most people think they're reacting to reality. They're not. They're reacting to the story they built around it. Something happens, and in less than a second, your mind fills in the gaps. Someone ignores your message. Now it's not just silence. It's disrespect. It's rejection. It's they don't value me. Your boss gives short feedback. Now it's not just information. It's criticism. It's doubt. It's I'm not good enough. But none of that was actually said. You added it. Quietly. Automatically. Instantly. And once that story is in place, your emotions follow it. You don't feel what happened. You feel what you decided it meant. That's the trap. Marcus Aurelius understood this at a level most people never reach. He would strip events down to their raw form. An insult, just words. A loss, just a change in circumstance. A problem, just a situation requiring action. No drama, no narrative, no added meaning. Because the moment you remove the story, you remove the suffering attached to it. Think about how many times you've been upset over something, only to realize later it didn't matter at all. The event didn't change. Your interpretation did. And with it, your entire emotional state. This is why two people can go through the same situation and walk away completely different. One carries anger for hours. The other lets it go in minutes. Same moment. Different meaning. So the real question isn't, what happened to me? It's, what did I make it mean? Because that meaning is where your power lives. If you can control that, you can change everything. Not by pretending nothing matters, but by seeing clearly what actually does. And most of the time, it's far less than you think. Pillar 2, the obstacle, is the path most people spend their lives trying to avoid difficulty. They plan around it. They delay because of it. They complain when it shows up. They treat obstacles like interruptions. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that needs to be removed before life can continue. But the Stoics saw it differently. They didn't ask, "Why is this happening to me?" They asked, "What is this trying to build in me?" Because every obstacle carries something most people miss. Instruction, pressure, opportunity, not the kind that feels good in the moment, but the kind that changes you if you face it correctly. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That's not philosophy. That's a shift in how you move through life. Think about the last time something went wrong. A rejection, a failure, a situation that didn't go your way. Your first instinct was probably resistance, frustration, disappointment, maybe even anger, because it disrupted your plan. But what if that disruption was the path? What if the rejection forced you to level up? What if the failure exposed something you needed to fix? What if the delay protected you from something worse? Most people never find out, because they stop at the obstacle. They turn back. They complain. They wait for something easier. But the man who moves forward anyway becomes different. He doesn't need perfect conditions. He doesn't need everything to go his way. He adapts. He adjusts. He uses what's in front of him. And over time, that builds something most people never develop. Resilience. Not surface-level toughness, but deep, internal strength. The kind that doesn't break when things go wrong, because it was built through things going wrong. This is where your edge comes from. While others are slowed down by obstacles, you're shaped by them. While they wait for better conditions, you become better within the conditions. And eventually, something shifts. You stop seeing life as something that happens to you. You start seeing it as something that sharpens you. Every challenge, every setback, every difficult moment. Not a block, but a forge. And if you stay in it long enough, you come out stronger than the version of you that walked in. Pillar 3, the space where power lives. There is a moment most people never notice. It's small, almost invisible, but it decides everything. It's the space between what happens and what you do next. Someone says something that hits a nerve. You feel it instantly. That surge, that tightening in your chest, that impulse to respond right now. That's the moment. And most people miss it. They react immediately. Words come out before they think. Tone shifts. Energy changes. And just like that, they've lost control. Not because the situation was powerful, but because they gave it power. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." That power doesn't show up later. It shows up right there, in that small gap. But here's the problem. That gap is uncomfortable. It feels unnatural to pause. It feels weak to stay silent. It feels like you're losing if you don't respond immediately. So people rush to fill it. They react. And then, later, they regret. But the man who trains himself to stay in that space becomes different. He feels the emotion, but doesn't obey it. He notices the impulse, but doesn't act on it. He gives himself a second, maybe two, and in that second, everything changes. Because now he's choosing, not reacting. Think about how many situations would have gone differently if you had just paused. That argument you escalated, that message you wish you didn't send, that moment you lost your composure, all of it happens inside that gap. This is where control is built. Not in big decisions, in small pauses. At first, it feels forced. You have to remind yourself to breathe, to wait, to hold back. But over time, it becomes natural. The gap gets wider. The reaction gets slower. The control gets stronger. And eventually, something shifts. You stop being someone who reacts to life. You become someone who responds to it. And that difference is everything, because the man who owns that space owns himself. Understanding this is one thing. Living it is something else entirely, because in the moment, when emotion hits, everything you've learned disappears. The theory fades. The habit takes over. And that habit has been built over years. Years of reacting fast, speaking too soon, letting emotion lead before thought has a chance to catch up. So if you want to change this, you don't need motivation. You need training, deliberate, repeated, uncomfortable training. It starts small. The next time something irritates you, don't fix it. Don't respond immediately. Just notice it. Feel the reaction rise and stay still. That alone is progress, because awareness breaks autopilot. Then you add the pause. One breath, then another. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to delay the reaction long enough to see it clearly. And in that clarity, you start to see patterns. What triggers you, where you lose control, how quickly your mind jumps to conclusions. This is where real change begins. Not by forcing yourself to be calm, but by understanding how you lose it. From there, you redirect, not the situation, your attention. Instead of focusing on what they said, you focus on how you respond. Instead of trying to control the outcome, you control your action. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" you ask, "What's the best move right now?" This is training, and like any training, it compounds. Day by day, the reactions weaken, the pauses strengthen, the control becomes automatic, until one day, you notice something subtle but powerful. The things that used to trigger you don't hit the same, not because life got easier, but because you got sharper, more aware, more deliberate, more in control. And that's when you realize you're no longer practicing this. You've become it. At some point, it stops feeling like effort, not because life got easier, but because you stopped making everything harder than it needs to be. The same situations still happen. People still say things. Plans still fall apart. Unexpected problems still show up. But something about you is different. You don't chase every reaction anymore. You don't get pulled into every emotional wave. You don't feel the need to respond to everything that happens around you. There's space now between the event and your response, and in that space, there's control. You start to move differently, more deliberate, more focused, more grounded. You're not rushing to prove anything, not explaining yourself to everyone, not carrying things that were never yours to begin with. And people notice, not because you're louder, because you're steadier. You become the person who doesn't escalate tension, who doesn't add noise to chaos, who doesn't lose control when things don't go their way. And in a world where most people are reactive, that makes you rare. This is what the Stoics meant by strength. Not dominance, not force. Control. Control over your thoughts. Control over your reactions. Control over what you choose to carry and what you let go. You stop trying to control the world. And because of that, the world stops controlling you. That's the shift. You're no longer a product of what happens. You're the one deciding what it means and what to do next. And that kind of man is hard to shake. So don't try to master everything at once. Pick one habit, one moment, one reaction, and train it. Because this isn't built in a day. It's built in decisions. Small ones, repeated, until one day you realize something quietly powerful. You're not the same person who used to react to everything. You're someone who chooses. And that's where real freedom begins. If you're ready to step into that version of yourself, drop "I control my mind" in the comments. And if you're serious about building this kind of discipline, make sure you subscribe, because this isn't motivation, this is transformation.